Hi everyone, it's Marian, and in today's video, I'll be sharing with you the worst mistakes that I have made when propagating houseplants. Thank you so much for joining me today, and in the previous video, I shared my top 5 propagation hacks, and in this video, I'll be sharing with you plant propagations that I have made and mistakes that you should avoid when you are propagating houseplants yourselves. I wish that I could say that these are things that I wish I knew before I started plant propagating so I could have avoided them, but I'm actually a repeat offender of this mistake. So do as I say, not as I do. And I'll be sharing 5 of my worst plant propagation mistakes in this video as well. And if you're new to my channel, hi, my name is Marian. Welcome to My Oasis Life, where I take you along my houseplant journey and share with you some of my tips and tricks along the way, and also share lifestyle content that is focused on sustainability, wellness, productivity, as well as sharing with you some of my personal and travel vlogs. So if that type of content interests you, please do consider subscribing before the end of this video. And please make sure to like this video and also leave your comment down below. I would appreciate your feedback. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started with this video. So these are my top 5 worst plant propagation mistakes. Number 1, giving my plant propagation too much humidity, not enough airflow. So nowadays it's very popular to use something like a cloche, prop box, or a greenhouse to propagate our house plants, and I highly recommend using those because those have worked really well for me. But one of the biggest mistakes in using those types of methods, or why it fails, is giving the plants too much humidity and not enough airflow. And while humidity is great in speeding up the growth of our plant propagations, it can also be the cause of speeding up the rotting process in our plant propagations. And the way to ensure that humidity doesn't kill your plant propagation is to make sure that there's enough airflow either in your cloche, prop box, or greenhouse. And for most indoor greenhouses, having fans inside makes the most sense, but as you know, my IKEA greenhouse cabinet doesn't have a fan in it because my IKEA greenhouse cabinet is not weather stripped. So the humidity levels in my IKEA greenhouse cabinet is just relative humidity because it is not tightly enclosed. But if you have an indoor greenhouse that have higher levels of humidity inside, then definitely invest in something like a fan or something that would encourage airflow inside of it, especially when you have your plant propagations. And same goes with prop boxes. Prop boxes are usually very tightly sealed, and that's the way to have it work, is to make sure that the prop boxes are tightly sealed so that the condensation can happen. But I think the mistake that a lot of us is making with prop boxes is using prop boxes that are way too small for our propagations. Not just because the plants are a lot bigger for the box that they're in, but because there's no space for actual airflow inside the humidity box or the prop box. And people have recommended that you should open up your prop box so that fresh air can come in, and that is great practice and all, but if that is something that you're doing on a daily basis or way too frequently, to me that defeats the purpose of having a prop box. A properly sized and set up prop box should be like a terrarium. You shouldn't need to open it up frequently, and it should be for the most part very self-sustaining after you set it up. So to make sure that the prop box is properly working is to make sure to get a big enough prop box that would allow airflow inside of the box and not just fit the plants that you're putting in there. Especially when the prop box have started to form condensation and your plants are touching the condensation on the side or on the top of the prop box, then that leads to the rotting of your plants. So you can definitely jam pack your prop box if you want. I have done that, but just make sure there's enough space for airflow as well, that your plants is not touching the lid of the prop box or the sides of the prop box, because that would lead to the rotting of your plant propagations. And second plant propagation mistake that I've made is letting my propagations dry out. When it comes to our established plants, it is recommended a lot of times to let our plants dry out before we water them, but when it comes to our plant propagations, it's actually detrimental to let your propagations dry out, and usually it's very hard for them to bounce back after that. I recently, with my Epipremnum variegata, I had it dry out and did water it in time, and I lost the root growth it has. So it's kind of like the opposite of root rot. It was root dry out, and it just couldn't bounce back after that, and I had to cut the roots and put it back into a water propagation situation so that it could start growing roots again. So unlike a lot of our houseplants that needs to be dried out and can bounce back after being dried out, a lot of our plant propagations cannot do the same. But there's a caveat to that. which leads to my plant propagation mistake number 3 is putting my plant propagation in oversaturated mediums. And this usually happens when I propagate my plants in inert mediums such as sphagnum moss, perlite, coco coir, or anything similar. And especially for sphagnum moss, it does absorb a lot of moisture, and propagating your plants in an overly saturated moss would cause your plants to rot. So if you're propagating a plant in a material like moss, you'd want it to be damp. So after you soak it in water, you have to make sure to squeeze out a lot of the moisture as much as you can before you use it to propagate your houseplants. And after that, you want to keep the sphagnum moss moist, but not overly saturated or not overly wet. And I do like using sphagnum moss. I have great success in propagating in sphagnum moss, but to avoid a situation where you have your sphagnum moss overly saturated, you would want to mix it with something like perlite, vermiculite, or any soil amendment that would help increase drainage and also provide more aeration with using the sphagnum moss. And my plant propagation mistake number 4 is transplanting the plant way too soon or combining it with the mother plant way too soon. Plant propagation, for the most part, is a test of patience. And sometimes when we see some root growth already growing, it's very tempting to take it out of the water propagation or any propagation setup it has and immediately pot it up. And that usually leads to the plant dying. And that has happened to me many times, either I transplanted the plant too soon in a soil mix or I combined it with the mother plant too soon. And the way to avoid that is to make sure that you have enough root growth before you start the transplanting process. And what I mean by sufficient root growth, it just doesn't mean that the main root has grown maybe like 3 or 4 inches long already, but it also has started to grow secondary roots. So to me, that signals that the plant is a little bit more established, a little bit more resilient, and can handle, for the most part, transplant shock when you do actually transplant them. But of course, there's a lot more steps that you need to take to ensure that your plant survive the transplant process. But one of the best indicators is making sure that your cutting has grown secondary roots first before you actually do any transplanting. And the last one on my list of worst plant mistakes is plant propagation mistake number 5 is using nutrients or using fertilizers way too soon. And I've talked about this before, but I do think in the houseplant community, we're a little bit obsessed with providing nutrients and fertilizers for our houseplants even before we got the basics for our houseplants correctly, especially when it comes to water, soil, and lighting. And when it comes to our plant propagations, I've also have made the mistake of giving my plants fertilizers or nutrients way too early because for the most part, our plant propagations don't really need them. At most, I would give them Super Thrive when I have transplanted them because Super Thrive has been known to help plants adjust from transplant shock, but actually giving them fertilizer or nutrients that we give to our established plants, that is something that I would hold off on and wait until the plants have actually become established plants. Because for the most part, especially when we are transplanting our houseplants or repotting them already, the soil mix that we use is fresh and already contains some nutrients or already have some fertilizers in them. So we don't really need to be giving them fertilizers, especially high dose of fertilizers or the dosage that we give to our regular houseplants. And even if we cut back on the amount of nutrients or fertilizers that we give our recently propagated houseplants, we don't really know how much our houseplants could take when it comes to processing fertilizers and nutrients already, even though in our mind or we know that we already gave them a much lower dosage. And I know people would disagree in this, but unless you really know what you're doing, you are a professional grower or just have a lot of experience with propagating houseplants, I would definitely hold off with fertilizing or giving your plant propagations nutrients until they're a little bit more established or a little bit more mature. Unless, again, if you really know what you're doing and you know what you're giving them and how much and how often. Because sometimes we think we're helping our plants, but actually we are harming them. And by giving them nutrients or fertilizers they're not ready for, it causes over-fertilization, which actually stunts the growth of the plant. We are preventing the plant from accessing and processing the energy that they do need in order to continue to grow. And those are my top 5 worst plant propagation mistakes. Number 1 is giving the plant propagation too much humidity, not enough airflow. Second is letting the plant propagation dry out. Third is giving them an oversaturated medium. Fourth is transplanting them or combining them with a mother plant way too soon. And number 5 is giving them nutrients and fertilizers way too soon. And if you have any other plant propagation mistakes that you would like to warn other plant parents about, please do share them in the comments. And if you also haven't checked it out yet, do check out my best plant propagation hacks video. And if you want me to do a third video on this, like debunking a lot of the propagation myths and hacks out there, I already have like a couple in mind, but if you have any other ones that you kind of like want the houseplant community to stop doing, or you kind of want to fact check when it comes to plant propagation, then please do share them in the comments and I'll make sure to include them in my third propagation tips and tricks videos. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you're new here, please do subscribe. I come up with videos every week, and if you haven't yet, check out these videos up here until my next one. But until then, I see you, I appreciate you. Take care of yourself and each other, and have a plentiful day. Bye.